Good evening. Here now the news. Oh, this just in, thank you very much. We're taking a trip back in time to the 1960s era newsrooms, hence the black and white motif you see before you, to bring you a story that will indeed strain your credibility, as it does mine sometimes when I think about it. According to this information, the technology that we use in 2023 has a rather exotic origin. Now, there's a famous saying we use here at UFO Narrative, and that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But what if the extraordinary claims were backed up by extraordinary credentials? Certainly in the past, in earlier episodes we've looked at, the credentials of the messengers that brought forth these incredible stories may have been murky sometimes at best, or ill-defined. This time it's different. We're talking, of course, about Colonel Philip J. Corso, a military official who's retired, actually he's deceased at this point, who released a book in 1997 entitled The Day After Roswell. But his story is, although his story is incredible, his credentials are just as incredible. So instead of looking at the story first, this time we're going to look at the messenger, or more specifically his credentials. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Thank you for tuning back in again. Now let's take a look at Colonel Corso's credentials. Almost a tongue twister. I have it right here. Corso served in the military from 1942 to 1963, where he earned the rank of lieutenant colonel. We already know that. He served in Army intelligence in Europe and shortly became chief of U.S. counterintelligence in Rome. Now here's a photograph of Corso getting the Bronze Star from Brigadier General Brown for his service in that period of time, 1945, during which he arranged safe passage of 10,000 Jewish World War II refugees out of Rome to the British Mandate of Palestine. Wow. And through this activity, he became the personal emissary of Pope Paul VI. Wow, pretty cool stuff. From 1950 to 1953, during the Korean War, Corso served under General MacArthur as Chief of Special Projects Branch of the Intelligence Division Far East Command. What's with that pipe, MacArthur? What the hell are you smoking? Sorry, I apologize for that remark. We must maintain decorum. This is, after all, the news. From 1953 to 1957, Corso was on the staff of President Eisenhower's National Security Council. The big guns up there. And in 1961, he became chief of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Desk in Army R&D, working under Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau. Remember that name because he's going to play a large part in what happens next. So why am I spending an inordinate amount of time on Colonel Corso's credentials? I told you it was a tongue twister. Well, because the story he tells requires it, because it's an incredible story. Speaking of which, let's hear what Colonel Corso has to say. Let's hear his story.
The following program is brought to you in living color.
Welcome back. In this section, we're going to look at Colonel Corso's 2 years of work inside the hallowed halls of the Pentagon. Now, in 1997, he and co-author Bill Burns released a book called The Day After Roswell, which spent several weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. So people were curious, myself included. He stated in the book that for 2 years within the Pentagon, he led a double life. And what does that mean? He continued by telling us for those 2 years, he worked on some of the most top secret programs within the Pentagon. Very, very important. Under the auspices of a General Trudeau, who we looked at earlier in the news broadcast. Hidden beneath everything Corso did, and at the center of the totality of his existence while at the Pentagon, and hidden from those at the Pentagon, was a single file cabinet. This was brought into him by General Trudeau and 2 armed guards. Now that file cabinet, Corso revealed, held the Army's deepest and most closely guarded secret, the Roswell files, the cache of debris and information pulled out of the wreckage of a flying disc that had crashed outside the town of Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. Now, at the time, and this is according to Corso, the KGB had infiltrated much of what was going on at the CIA, which is kind of incredible. So there was very little trust going on. Trudeau, because he knew Corso and because of Corso's experience in military intelligence, trusted him implicitly, or at least he was the only one that he trusted to handle the contents of this file cabinet. So what I'd like to present to you now is Colonel Corso's original description of the items that were in that file cabinet. This is taken directly from his book. Now, we have to understand that the technology Corso is talking about, he's describing in terms of someone from 1961. As we will find out in the next and final section of this video, some of this technology was in its early stages of development, and Trudeau and Corso were hoping to give the United States an advantage by integrating the more advanced tech from the Roswell crash that was being developed at that time. Okay, so let me read to you some of Corso's comments concerning this technology. First, there were tiny, clear, single-filament, flexible glass-like wires twisted together through a kind of gray harness, as if they were cables going into a junction. They were narrow filaments, thinner than copper wire. As I held the harness of strands up to the light from my desk, I could see an eerie glow coming through them, as if they were conducting the faint light and breaking it up into different colors. This description would appear to indicate that what Corso held in his hand was actually fiber optic cable of some kind from the Roswell crash. Then there were the thin 2-inch around matte gray oyster cracker shaped wafers, a material that looked like plastic but had tiny road maps of wires barely raised or etched along the surface. They were the size of a quarter, but the etchings on the surface reminded me of the squashed insects with their 100 legs spread out at right angles along the surface. Some were more rounded and elliptical. Here we find essentially a description of something like a microprocessor. Next, I was most interested in the file descriptions accompanying a 2-piece set of dark elliptical eyepieces as thin as skin. The Walter Reed pathologist said they adhered to lenses of the extraterrestrial creature's eyes and seemed to reflect existing light, even in what looked like complete darkness. I believe Corso's alluding to night vision technology, obviously. Next, there was a dull, grayish, silvery foil-like swatch of cloth among these artifacts that you could not fold, bend, tear, or wad up, but that bounced right back into its original shape without any creases. When I tried to stretch it widthwise instead of lengthwise, it looked like the fibers had reoriented themselves to the direction I was pulling in. Now, perhaps this material appears to be similar to Kevlar-like material, made of bulletproof vests and things like that. Okay. Next, there was a written description and a sketch of another device, too, like a short, stubby flashlight, almost with a self-contained power source that was nothing at all like a battery. The scientists at Wright Field who examined it said they couldn't see the beam of light shoot out of it, but when they pointed the pencil-like flashlight at a wall, they could see a tiny circle of red light. But there was no actual beam from the end of what seemed like a lens to the wall. They played with this device a lot before they realized it was an alien cutting device like a blowtorch. Here, Corso's describing essentially a laser, or something like a laser. Next, and this is the strangest piece within this group of equipment that apparently nothing ever came of. Then there was the strangest device of all, a headband, almost with electrical signal pickup devices on either side. I could figure out no use for this thing whatsoever, unless whoever used it did so as a fancy hairband. So what happens next? How did Corso distribute this material, and what became of it? Let's find out. Welcome back. Now, before we begin this section, I have 2 questions I'd like to put out there, and you probably have the same questions in your mind. Number 1, is Colonel Corso claiming that there was no prior development of any of this technology, like microprocessors and fiber optic cable and night vision technology, before the Roswell crash, and that the Roswell crash, everything evolved through the Roswell crash? The answer to this is no. And there's a common misconception out there that Corso is saying that this technology came exclusively from the Roswell crash and there was no prior development over the course of history. All right, so we're going to explore that in the next section. Number 2, if the Roswell crash occurred in July of 1947, why did the Army wait till 1961 to do anything about it? Well, Corso has an answer to that too. First of all, the Army didn't have a particular group of people that handled the retrieval of crashed UFO discs, all right? It just didn't exist. The Army probably didn't know what to do with this stuff until General Trudeau, I believe Trudeau was kind of a visionary. He recognized that this technology could be weaponized. Certainly it could enhance existing technologies that were out there or under development. Maybe help the people who were developing them to leapfrog this stuff. The bigger part of this is that Trudeau did not want the Russians to get a hold of this technology, right? That was the big push here. And I believe that continues to this day. I believe that if David Grouch is telling the truth, and we do have technologies out there from other worlds, okay, that our government doesn't want the Russians to get hold of it, so they're adversaries, okay? It's not that they don't think the American people can handle the truth, all right? Because I think we can, most of us anyway, all right? But they don't want their adversaries to gain hold of this technology. So Corso and Trudeau came up with a plan as to how to distribute and proliferate this technology. First, they were going to consult scientists like Werner von Braun and Hans Olbert. Now, these two scientists, Werner von Braun specifically is known as the father of modern rocketry. So without these scientists, without von Braun, certainly, we would never have gotten to the moon, or maybe it would have taken us many more years, because the Germans were doing all this research on the V2, and they had the technology. So that's a whole other story within itself. Eventually, the team expanded to John von Neumann, Robert Sarbacher, and Hans Kohler. Now, these were all scientists with top secret security clearance, right, that were aware of the Roswell crash. They had heard about it, or they were directly involved with it in some fashion. Okay, so now the next step was to gather together companies. These were defense contractors who the Army was already working with to distribute the materials to. Well, how would they do that? Well, what they did was Corso decided that they would take more mundane technologies, okay, and mix them up with the Roswell tech, the stuff in the Roswell crash, right, and distribute them that way. This way there would be no suspicion as to, wow, what is this thing, where'd it come from, all right? And the idea was to have these companies develop their own patents for this material as it began to evolve within the company, or if it already existed, they would add to and enhance the materials through this Roswell tech, all right, through the crash tech. That was the big idea here. Corso has famously said, as far as the world knows, the history of the technology comes from the patent, okay, not from something before the patent. So that's how it would be written in the history books, I guess you could say. All right, so this is a very interesting approach, because a lot of this technology was already being developed, and we're going to talk about that in the next section. To conclude, let's take a look at the more traditional historical development of this technology through human beings, and then see how the Roswell materials may have enhanced or helped the development of this technology along the way. Welcome back to the newsroom. Thanks for tuning in again. In this final section of the broadcast, we're going to talk about the historical transmission of this technology, how it evolved over the course of time, and the people involved in its development. We will then piggyback some of the comments concerning the Roswell tech and how it was integrated into this technology, according to Colonel Corso. So, here we go. Fiber optic cable. The first fiber optic cable data transmission system was demonstrated by German physicist Manfred Berner at Telefunken Research Labs in Ulm in 1965. Berner applied for a patent in 1966. But way before this, in the late 1800s, a team of Viennese doctors used bent glass rods to funnel light into areas of the body, or body cavities, where surgery needed to be done. And they couldn't get light in, they couldn't see well enough. It's pretty brilliant, if you ask me, right? Now, Daniel Colladon and Jacques Babinet first demonstrated the guiding of light by refraction in Paris in the early 1840s. So wow, fiber optic cable, at least the concept for it, goes way back into the 1800s. Now, in The Day After Roswell, Corso talks about consulting with Dr. Hans Kohler, we've talked about earlier, concerning experiments going on at Bell Labs, using this tech that was still under development. Trudeau wanted to redesign the Army's entire communication system. He felt it was really primitive. I mean, this guy was really a visionary. I have to hand it to General Trudeau. Really amazing, all right? Corso believed that the fiber optic technology that was from the Roswell craft was more advanced, and it really gave it a jump start in terms of humanity developing this technology, right? So there's a common misconception here for people who say they've read this book, who've reviewed it, or people who talk about it, and they claim that Corso claims that the technology we use today came exclusively from the Roswell crash, and he claims there was no previous development. Well, there are pages and pages in this book where Corso talks about the historical development of this technology, but how the Roswell technology helped leapfrog this technology to where it is today, okay? How about the microprocessor? Let's take a look at that. According to my research, the microprocessor appeared on the scene in 1971, and although there was significant debate concerning its creation, one of the more prominent people was Marcian Ted Hoff, who received a PhD in 1962 at Stanford and found his way to Motorola, where he took courses in integrated circuit design. But he ended up at Intel, where the first commercial 4-bit microprocessor was released in 1971. It was known as the Intel 4004. However, the work with transistors began in the 1960s. Specifically at Fairchild Semiconductor. A physicist there, Federico Fagan, who had been developing silicon gate MOS technology, joined Intel and was directly involved in the development of the aforementioned Intel 4004 processor, along with Hoff, Stanley Mazar, and Masatoshi Shima. So we see there is a history, of course it's a history to the microprocessor. It was long in development. Now, Corso addresses this in the book, where Trudeau instructs him to go to Sperry Rand, Hughes, Bell Labs, and Motorola, as a transistor, Trudeau says, came out of their shops, and these look a lot like the transistorite circuit. So he's talking about the wafers that came out of the Roswell crash, the etched wafers that Corso talks about, right? That's what Trudeau's talking about. However, the microprocessors from the Roswell craft were, according to Corso, more sophisticated and developed. So perhaps this gave scientists a significant leap in technology, right? Developing the microprocessor, if this is all true. Night vision. In 1929, Hungarian physicist Kalman Tihanyi invented an infrared-sensitive electronic television camera for anti-aircraft defense in the UK. That's 1929. Night vision devices were actually used by the Germans as early as 1939, and were used in World War II on their Panzer tanks, so they could see where they were going in the dark, right? Much to General Patton's dismay, I would imagine. Now, concerning this technology, Trudeau was well aware that it was used by the Germans during World War II and was under development, but recognized that, like the microprocessor and fiber optic cable, the Roswell tech was far more developed and advanced, okay? So, there you go. Kevlar. Kevlar was developed by Stephanie Kwolek at DuPont in 1965. The high-strength material was first used commercially in the early 1970s as a replacement for the steel used in racing car tires. Interesting. So Kevlar was first used in racing car tires. Well, that's something I did not know until I did this, right? Corso was sent to Trudeau. Corso was sent by Trudeau to DuPont and Monsanto with the material from the craft. Remember that piece of material that he could stretch and bend, and the fibers would realign themselves depending on which way he stretched it. He literally handed this material to scientists at DuPont. Now, I'm not taking anything away from Stephanie Kwolek's brilliance, a brilliant scientist, okay? I'm not taking anything away. All I'm saying is that Corso says that he handed this material to scientists at DuPont in the 1960s, okay? And that's how it goes. The laser. The development of the laser dates back to 1917, where Albert Einstein first described his theory of stimulated emission. Now, this was, of course, a theory, but the practical device has its roots in the 1940s and early 1950s, particularly the work on microwave spectroscopy, a powerful tool for discovering the characteristics of a wide variety of molecules, by physicists Charles Townes, Arthur Schwarlow, and others, and the subsequent invention of the maser, microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. Now you know why I'm reading this. Townes and colleagues at Columbia University demonstrated a working maser in 1953, 2 years after similar devices were independently invented by researchers at the University of Maryland and Lebedev Labs in Moscow. Now, Corso speaks to the development of a particle beam weapon inspired by Nikola Tesla's death ray. And if you don't know about that, you definitely want to look that up. It's fascinating. Trudeau saw the limitless potential of the laser as a way to destroy Soviet satellites from the ground. Now, we talked about the Sputnik satellite in the very first video we did on Roswell, and people were terrified by this thing. It wasn't a very powerful satellite. It couldn't even, it had no cameras or anything. It didn't have the technology back then. All it did was orbit the Earth and make a beeping sound, okay? It was like a test. So, I mean, it was an amazing achievement, but people were terrified at the time. So Trudeau felt that this would be a great way to shoot them down without having to launch a spaceship to destroy them. Again, I think Trudeau is really a visionary. Now, so the way I see this is the way Corso suggests in his book, that the technology was already evolving through humanity, all right, through human beings, right? But the Roswell tech was a more advanced version of it, and it helped to, you know, give it the bump that it needed to get to the technology that we use today. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't really smart people around. I mean, obviously, the gap between the vacuum tube and the transistor is a significant gap. However, that doesn't mean there wasn't some brilliant genius who figured this out, right? I mean, you know, like Corso was not saying that this tech came exclusively from the Roswell crash. He fully recognizes, and in this book, which is a very complex book, is loaded with page after page after page on the historical development of these technologies and how the Roswell tech helped to further enhance them. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, it's really up to you to either believe what Corso says or not believe what Corso says. My question is this: you know, people like Bob Lazar, Jesse Marcel, David Grouch, these brave people who come forward, right, and talk about the existence of this technology, right? You can choose to believe them or not believe them, right? It's up to you. All of this is up to you, ultimately. Who controls the narrative, right? Corso here is controlling the narrative, but he's not saying it's an exclusive narrative. He's saying that the development of this technology by human hands was here. It existed already, but it was in its elemental stages. And the Roswell technology helped to enhance that technology to what we have today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it makes sense, and I hope you continue to watch UFO Narrative. Please, if you like the video, subscribe. And if you like it, well, click the like button. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.